Good morning. The official title of this talk is The Foundation for Intercultural Mission. I don't know, not quite sure what that means, but it sounds cool. You could also say why religious freedom and literacy development should be your best friend. Here's the thing I want you to take away from it. I believe the church, the building's job is to deepen disciples such that the church, the body outside of the building, can make disciples and to be living stones, as Ruth talked about today. And I think religious freedom and literacy development are absolutely foundational to that. They're not the cornerstone, but they are foundational and plumb-lined off that perfect cornerstone. It's that simple. So they are the foundation to ministry. You cannot in many ways have the church without these two things. And I would also argue that you cannot have a civil society without these two things. And so what I'm going to try and do today is talk you through what I think the scriptural foundation is for these things. Then I'm going to talk to you about a theology of engagement that results. I don't think if you have a foundation without a structure for engagement, a house of engagement, why have a foundation? So you got to have the foundation to understand the structure, to be the building and the body. And then in the process of doing that, have some terms of reference that we talk about and discuss and analyze, and then conclude with why religious freedom and literacy development are useful to you in terms of how you make the argument to the secular world, which is very important because I don't want this to get reduced to another thing within the missiological silo. We're called to be in the world, not of it, and doggone it for it. So how do you do that? Before we get started, though, I want to talk a little bit about our organization, IGE. A number of you have asked questions, well, what do you do? And the answer is I don't know, and that's a good thing, because there's mystery to God, and that keeps us all humble. But the short answer to what we do is we're a think tank with legs. If you're feeling less poetic, which is often the case with former Marines, we're a think and do tank. Think and do. You think before you do. You aim before you fire. Simple common sense, but common sense ain't so common sometimes. So if you're a think tank with legs, that means that you're in a twofold business. You are in the education business, which is different than training. Training is more analogous to management and operating according to norms and implementing things that people have thought through before. Education is about critical thinking. It's equipping people to think and to apply the principles that we find in the gospel. So you got to be in the education business, and then you got to be in the engagement business. That's what we do. And we're very analogous to how Doug Johnson operates in this fashion. In fact, I can think of no other think tanks with legs or think and do tanks besides Doug's in the evangelical world, let alone the think tank world of Washington, which I operate in. And isn't it curious that every issue in Washington, D.C. has a liberal think tank and a conservative think tank for and against whatever the issue of the day is? Where are the kingdom think tanks? Where are the Christ-centered, Bible-based, God of history-driven think tanks that aren't going to tell you what to do and what decisions to make, but enable you to make better decisions? Because people of theological conviction will have differences, but we are called to love each other across those differences and to make better decisions as deepening disciples of Christ. So, on the think side, and by the way, that we are nonpartisan and non-proselytizing. Let me say that up front. We're staffed by mostly evangelicals. We have Democrats and Republicans on our team. We're nonpartisan. That's a legal requirement in terms of being a 501c3 that can receive money, tax-exempt money for donations. But we're non-proselytizing. I'm very careful in the diction there. We're not going out and proclaiming the word in direct fashion, using the four spiritual laws, those kinds of things. But I would say that we are evangelical, and I know we are. We're practicing the axiom of St. Francis of Assisi: go into all the world, preach the gospel, use words if necessary. Or as Dad said last night, live an example, live the way that begs and provokes the question. This is exactly what Doug Johnson does. Exactly. So when I'm in a communist or Islamist country, we can say, hey, we don't proselytize. They're very comfortable with that right away. but I am evangelical, which is to say I'm evangelizing you just because I'm having this conversation. We're at the same table. It may be 20 years, but that's not for me to figure out. That's for God to figure out. As was said last night, we water. Success is not success, something that's quantified. It's something called obedience. So we operate between the leftover left and the self-righteous right in the American context, trying to be in that radical middle that is the way. We do a thing called the Council on Faith International Affairs. I'll remind you that your free copy is waiting right over there for you. We started the journal just to demonstrate that evangelicals could write with footnotes, even though some of us are adverse to them. And to write in such a fashion that it was accessible, scholars and practitioners. We soon found out that in this post-9/11 world, it had to be a multi-faith forum because nobody knows how to talk about the two things that you've been taught not to talk about in polite company, assuming you keep polite company, since you were kids. And what are they? Religion and politics. The problem of it, the bummer of it all, is our global civil society, our global security exists right at their intersection. And we also happen to worship a sovereign Lord who operates even in those fields afar through people like Doug Johnson. So what are you going to do about it? So we created this thing where we could have a forum, a scholarly forum that was available to talk about religion and politics as a multi-faith and community and to include those who have no faith at all. And wouldn't you know it, but in terms of how desperate times are, an organization founded and led by two former Marines, staffed by evangelicals, it's the only journal of its kind in the field. And yet it's abstracted with all the academic indices, the Council on Foreign Relations, Stanford University even, has it on their bookshelves in their libraries. There's nothing else there. So why not go with this thing that seems to be credible and scholarly? So that's one thing we do. You've got to create a space to talk about religion and politics, talk about why religious freedom is important. The second thing that we do in the education business is what we're doing here today. We believe, and part of the founding of the Institute, is that we have to be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. And last night we heard an autobiographical reflection about what that means or what it hasn't meant in the evangelical experience of how the gospel has been made timely in the cultural experience known as America, and how that cultural experience is transitioning and rediscovering the roots of the first century so that we can make the timeless message timely again. So how do we challenge Christians to make that timeless message timely? How do we say, you know what, maybe there's a few old wineskins that aren't ready for the new wine. Maybe we need some new wineskins. I find it fascinating. I don't over-spiritualize it, but Doug Johnson's group and our group were started within 6 months of each other. A year and a half before 9/11. Back to Bob Creason. Is that an accident? Or maybe I'm just delusional. I don't know which, but here we are 8 years later, and there aren't a lot of folks who are in that radical middle ground between religion and politics trying to say we can be both and God is in both. So we challenge folks as we challenge Christians to claim the admonition to be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. But that's just the thinking. And what we do, how we engage the world, is through religious freedom. We believe religious freedom, the freedom to choose or not choose faith freely, is consistent with the Creator's intent. The author of life gives us the freedom to rebel against Him, as Pastor James said yesterday, or maybe it was Reverend Kim, I'm not sure which, but it was said a number of times. So if you're going to do that and everybody is made in the image of God, how do you work to promote religious freedom? How do you promote a level playing field where if your faith is strong enough and you're into obedience, you're not so worried about the number of souls saved and hands raised for Jesus because you know the truth with a capital T is going to win that day. Sometimes you might be blessed to actually lead a few folks or many folks to Christ. But what's more important is how you do it, is how you live the gospel and beg the example. I'll come back to that in a little bit about what disciples are. So we practice a thing called relational diplomacy. You can call it whatever you want to call it. I think it's basically Jesus at the well, John 4. who in their right mind goes and talks to a woman in a patriarchal society without other men around, and a woman who happens to belong to a theologically despised minority? Jesus. That's radical. That's what we're called to do. Go out and love the marginalized on the cruel edges of the world. And when Dad started the organization, that is the vision statement. That is the purpose statement. From the Message translation of Hebrews 11, the cruel edges, to make Christ visible and Christians relevant on the cruel edges of the world. And as we heard last night, we don't want to be irrelevant. That's the ultimate insult to a sovereign God who has a very specific purpose for us, who knew us before we were made, according to the Psalms, according to Isaiah 49. So we do relational diplomacy. We're not worried about the quarterly report to our donors, which gets us in trouble sometimes. By the way, try being a religious freedom organization that's evangelical, trying to raise money. The secular folks don't trust you because you're Christian and clearly you have a secret agenda. We know you're up to something. But then go to the Christian and say, hey, we don't proselytize. I can't tell you how many people I'm going to save by the end of March 31st. Well, then we can't fund you. You're not doing the kingdom. We're not your Father's missions organization, but we're about our Father's mission. And so it's a different approach. We work in places like Pakistan, Northwest Frontier Province. We work in Laos, Vietnam, other parts of East Asia, Uzbekistan. Now we're getting involved in Syria, in the Middle East, in the West Bank. In each and every situation, I can't tell you that for all my training in international relations and Marine Corps, and as George W. would say, in strategery, we're following the vision. We're following the mission, and it's revealed, and God reveals it in crazy ways. And usually it's with me because I'm an American and I'm all those things that Ruth described this morning. Do it yourself, you got all the answers. Jesus has got to hit you over the head with a 2x4. And about the 10th time, that's when I start breaking the code. So not as smart as I look by a long shot. So this is what we do. This is how we do it. We try to do it top down and bottom up simultaneously. It looks different in every context, but we try to engage the governments top down and the religious communities or grassroots communities bottom up. Government, grassroots, top down, bottom up. And then you go in and find ways to love them in a language and logic they understand. And you know what? It doesn't matter what your organizational purpose is or any of those things. As you build relationships and respect, it's that you come back and that you listen. And about the year 18 months, if God's moving at warp speed in that culture, as he sometimes does, and that's been our experience in Pakistan, 2 years, 3 years, 19 years, you get to a place where you're part of the family. And if you're made in the image of God, there ought to be a family resemblance, right? And there ought to be evidence to accuse us of being his disciples, of being Christians through our behavior. As one person said to me in Uzbekistan when I started breaking the code, that the problem with CP, with church planting, is the church. That was told to me by a Southern Baptist missionary. You just got to find ways to go out and do it differently and be organic and be consistent with the nature of the environment of which you're called to engage. And you can't be that way if you're just going to go in with your strategy and your steps and all those kinds of things. You just got to let the Lord reveal who he is and with whom he's working, and then come alongside. So that's what we do in a nutshell, and you're going to hear a number of these themes as we go through the process. The background of this talk is that I have two passions in life. One is religious freedom. The other is Bible translation, literacy development. Now, I will tell you that I was not born with these things. I was born with a passion for global engagement, international affairs. I've known that since I was a young child. But after 5 years on the Wycliffe board, the horror, and 8 years at IGE, it is now beginning to dawn on me, 2x4 to the head, that these things belong together for a reason, and they might be instrumental in how we go about our mission in the future. Now, even that, I still wouldn't have put this talk together until Larry said to me, I heard you say this at the board meeting once. It's the foundation for all ministry, religious freedom and literacy development. What do you mean by that? And, that was just it. With evangelicals, it's great. You can throw out bumper stickers and don't have to explain anything, right? And then you just proof text it and everything's okay. All right. So Larry challenged me, and so this is my first time thinking this out loud. So I approach you with great humility, the audacity of humility, right? And I'm thinking out loud with you in real time. So if there's disconnects and you're thinking, hey, there's a synaptic failure there, or the gerbil fell off the wheel and it's not going anymore, just bear with me. Watch the tape later and say, oh, maybe that's what he meant, and we'll come back to it. But I think these two things are the foundation of both civil society and ministry. And you need to understand the relationship between the two. In fact, I would argue, and I will at the end, if you understand that the foundation of civil society in a secular pluralistic sense, you're going to be a better disciple, a better minister. Your ministry will go better. And I'm going to try and use some different words and logic that you've all heard, but I don't think it always gets folded into our missiological silo in the name of religious freedom and literacy development. So here's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to start with a scriptural basis for religious freedom and Bible translation, just remind you of the very obvious, and suggest that this is the basis for all ministry. And then I'm going to say that this understanding begs a deeper thinking about how we engage the world, your call to global engagement, your vocation, what it means to all be missionaries, all 7 days of the week. And then I'm going to end with how that religious freedom and Bible translation, literacy development, is actually the key to influencing all sectors of society. And use secular logic and secular words. That if I started with that, you might just say, oh, you're not evangelical. You're not out doing the Great Commission. But if I end with it after I have all this talk, I'm hoping you'll say that they're two sides of the same coin, and we got to be smart enough to operate on the sacred and the secular side of the same coin, because God's in both. And we can't be 6-day secularists. So that's where I'm coming from. The scriptural basis, Matthew 18:20. We all know the verse. We've all prayed it a million times. When 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I will be there also. So this is the fundamental question. What if 2 or 3 can't gather? Now we know Jesus will still be there. We know the Spirit will still be there. But it begs a question. 2 or 3 gathered. They have to have the freedom to gather. With all of our problems in America, we have the freedom to gather and have a conversation like this. We take it for granted. There are people desperate around the world. The number one need in the world is discipleship, and they're ready to have a conference like this, and most of them can't meet and talk about it. And here we are, we have an opportunity to talk about it. It's a blessing. It's a blessing. So what if you can't meet? And then why would Jesus say that? How would he say that? I mean, how is it that he says that? Well, it's because he was there with them. Incarnational diplomacy, or to mix Pastor James and Dad's comments last night, it's inching incarnationalism. You're inching into their lives. You're building relationships. Jesus dwelt among us, so we too must dwell among the folks that we are called to engage. And it doesn't mean being over there. It could be here in town. The folks that you meet through your church ministry, the soup kitchens, all those kinds of things. So what if you didn't have the Word of God? John 1, the Word was God. There's no getting around this, folks. And because he dwelt among us, he created disciples who recorded his living word that speak to us. And my argument to you today is the church is not the church unless 2 or 3 gathered in his name studying his word. The church has to make, and that's how disciples happen. It's not easy proof texting. It's not all this kumbaya, yada, yada. It's getting into the deep nitty-gritty of what it means to be a disciple this day. And the only way that you can do that is being in relationships of accountability in your local church, whatever that building looks like, whatever that gathering looks like. And if you can do that, then you can go out and be living stones and be the church without walls, to be the body of Christ and work on all the spheres of life where he's already at work. If you can be a disciple, as it says in Ephesians 1, you will begin to see with the eyes of the heart. And as Bob mentioned yesterday, you'll be able to hunt better, forgive the terminology, for those not yet included. because you're going to not see with your eyes, you're going to see with your ears, you're going to see with your whole being, and you're going to see their whole presence and what their cultural context is like, and then you're going to be in a position to listen. So these things are important. Now, here's something I want you to know about, and I say this unashamedly as a Wycliffe board member. As important as literacy development is, and you can't become a disciple and you can't be the church without it, do you know how many evangelicals, what the percentage is that gives to Bible translation? 3%. We have a 97% unreached group in the evangelical community to support Bible translation. I want you to think for a second, and maybe many of you did today, this morning, I did. Imagine life without reading the Psalms in the morning or in the evening. There's 2,200 people groups who don't have that opportunity. And imagine being in a culture where the Bible exists in an older version that's not as relevant to who you are and what you're doing. Nothing against the King James Version, it's beautiful. But there are King James versions, 16, whatever it was, 04 or 11, that exist in some of these language groups that don't have the message in a more colloquial, more contemporary form. How are you going to make disciples if we can't talk to them in a language that speaks to their heart? The church ought to be ashamed about what it's not doing for Bible translation. 97% of us evangelicals, and that doesn't include the non-evangelicals who ought to be on the same team for the same win. As Pastor James said yesterday, I don't care how they get into heaven, there's going to be a celebration. Amen. Okay, so let's go to this next slide. I want to talk about what this means for how we think about the world. This is the world according to Garp, or Seiple, in a nutshell, and I want to spend some time talking you through this. And let me just briefly orient you. This right-hand side of the slide is how I think about the world. You can take it or leave it. These bottom three sections, civil society through economics, that's the world as it is. And then secondly, I want to go up to theology and how we think about engaging and get into some terms of reference. We've talked about globalization. What does that mean? What is it? I want to give you a point of contact for that. And then 3, get into what it means to love in this place as the world as it is. These are all the players out there right now, whether you like it or not. We tend to stay in our own little circle in the Venn diagram called faith, religion, and maybe if we're audacious, we move into NGOs or we think we're into culture. But all these other players are out there. Our government's working, as Doug has demonstrated, their government, international organizations, which are organizations that are made up of member states. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are people like all of us here in this room. What are they doing? How is God's at work in all those places. So that's what we're going to talk to. Then I'm going to conclude with what it means to operate at that center of the circle with respect according to secular language and logic for literacy diplomacy, maybe that's a word, literacy, development, and religious freedom. So here, civil society, geopolitics, economics, business. There are 2 characteristics for all these things, and you can add a whole lot more. It doesn't matter what your faith background is. One is that there's no single entity, state or non-state, that can solve any of those issues on that slide. Get past your bad self. I don't care if you're the Department of Defense or anything else. Nobody's got to solve it. So the second takeaway, and again, this is not rocket science, it's not a question of if, but when you partner. Whether you like it or not, you're going to partner with another entity, state and non-state. IG has written agreements with an Islamist and communist government. Is that part of your evangelical ideology growing up? It's not part of mine. I still can't believe it, but there we are. I'm just trying to catch up with Aslan. Now, the good news in all this is the third characteristic of all these things is that Jesus is already there. He doesn't need you, by the way. But he's already there, and he's accomplishing his purpose through the leaders he's raised up. And he's also already there because the church is already there. The church, his body of discipled ambassadors for Christ, is there in all of those spheres. They're all there, and the church sometimes just needs to be revealed from all those sectors of society. You're going to hear more about this from Bob Roberts in the next session. So who are we to say, come in and say, you need it, we got it, here's the answer, from water wells to education relief, whatever, Bible translation. There's good things that work in the world. You got to come alongside and partner with what's going on, with what he is already doing. As it says in John 12:26, where I am, my servants will be. Do you take Jesus at his word? Then expect him to be there. Okay, so how do you think about this from a theological point of view? And now we're going to spend some time up in this top right-hand side. First off, what is globalization? We throw that word around. It's almost meaningless these days. But I think globalization is simply this, and I borrow it from Os Guinness, with whom I had a long conversation a couple of minutes ago, is it's increased interconnectedness. I can tell you a whole bunch of other fancy ideas, how ideas and images influence through travel, technology, trade, yada, yada. It's increased interconnectedness. Easy enough. I'm into keep it simple, stupid, or Seiple. Sometimes those things are interchangeable, as Ruth reminded us so gently this morning. Now, the thing about globalization is whatever you think it is, it has one undeniable impact, and that is this. It is a siege on identity. It is a siege on identity. I can tell you from spending a lot of time in Waziristan on the border there and spending a lot of time where I live in rural evangelical Virginia, they don't like having their values threatened by these things over the satellite dish. And often they have the same exact stereotypes of one another, but that's a separate story. It's a siege on identity. What do I do? And in a siege on identity, what happens across the world is that you have a global psychological and spiritual dislocation. People are looking for meaning. And where are they going to find meaning? They're going to find it generally in, or many times, let's just say that, in religion. Religion provides a meta-narrative, an explanatory framework to make sense of this complex mess called our world today. By the way, this makes it hard for Americans to relate to the rest of the world because we're so into our fuzzy navel fuzzy gazing, whatever that is, that we're into postmodernism and all truth is relative and how do we relate and theology on tap and coffee things and this, that, and the other, and emergent church when the church has been around for 2,000 years. We got the best darn story in the world, and we ought to stick to that story. Because the rest of the world, the non-NATO world, the non-postmodern world, is in the pre-modern world where stories still matter. Pastor James said it yesterday. Folks still believe in miracles. Philip Jenkins, the best author in the world on this subject, at least in the North, he includes the whole chapter of James in his appendices. Why is that? Because I will show you my faith by what I do. This is what the pre-modern, non-NATO, non-postmodern world is doing, the development world is doing. And Jesus is relevant there. The first century is relevant because that's their experience. They pray and things happen. We pray and we pay and we forget about it. Feel better about ourselves if we can do our tax-exempt donations. But hey, no bitter feelings if somebody's trying to raise money. Okay. So the church needs to step into this vacuum. And the irony is, as we think about what globalization is, what organization is better prepared to be in that vacuum? The church is the original international NGO. Globalization is a part of our DNA, whether you realize it or recognize it or not. Let me give you an example of this that sums all this up. I've been to 2 or 3 Christian conferences, and it's fascinating to me. Thomas Friedman's a smart guy, and he's written some great books. I don't doubt that for one second. But when Christians start introducing and talking about globalization, who's their point of reference? It's Thomas Friedman. And globalization 1.0 starts in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's like the church began with the Reformation, right? How shallow. Globalization 1.0, folks, is Genesis 1 and 2. Claim it. Own it. 2.0 is Genesis 12. After Babel, Abram is the restorative attempt that God makes, the blessing on all the nations. 3.0, Great Commission. Go ye into all the world. And 4.0 is still coming. That's the good news. That's Revelation. We have a framework to think about this. So why are you relying on secular fundamentalists? It don't make no sense. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox there. But it does beg how we think about the Great Commission. And this is where Pastor Kim yesterday I thought was just brilliant. The Great Commission says, go ye into all the world, make disciples. So what have we done in our competitive, self-dependent American cultural context? We reduced that to quantification. How many hands raised? You know, we've all had those Wednesday night potluck dinners with paper plates and plastic forks, so we don't want to splurge too much. And we hear from the missionary just back from Africa, the heart of Africa, and they tell all these stories, and at the end they say something like 9 or 15 came to Christ. Whew, I'm glad there was a good ending to that story. What if she came back and said, you know, I've been there for 2 years, I'm just listening, I got one relationship. Is that going to sell? Probably not. So we got to get past our understanding of the Great Commission. It doesn't say go into all the world and make converts. It says go into all the world and make disciples. What is the church? And by the way, we do this often. We proof text within verses even. What did Jesus say before he said that? All things are under my authority in heaven and earth. I'm there in those spheres, folks. I don't care what your education is. I don't care what your calling. You're all fired up. You've just been to Urbana, move out. I'm already there. I do not need you. It is your precious privilege to come alongside what I'm already doing if you're in right relationship with me, if you're seeking to be obedient. The Great Commission is about disciples. He's already there. And lastly, we forget about the undeniable and non-accidental fact that the Great Commandment was given before the Great Commission. Jesus expects you to learn how to love before you go. And if you can't love, don't go. You'll embarrass our Creator. The question is, how do you love? Which gets us back to discipleship. How are we equipped within our church to go out and love our neighbor in a language and logic they understand? If I go out and love in a language and logic that I understand, and it's not received as love, guess what? It ain't love. It ain't love. So that means you have to go through a process of listening. And this is where we got this neat acrostic, at least according to me. What does it mean to love? Let me walk you through this, because this is what I think it means to be a disciple. And in the first two steps, listen and observe, see with the eyes of the heart, the whole being. That's the purpose. It exists at 3 levels. I need to listen and observe as to what God's doing in the world. I need to be in prayer. God, give me some wisdom and discernment. You can pray for these things. Pray for them daily. How is God moving? How is Aslan on the move? How do I come alongside what Jesus is doing? How do I remember that Paul picked the word ambassador intentionally? The word apostle means envoy. We're engaging on behalf of our state. Our state is not our country. That's a gift, to be sure, but our kingdom is the cause that we're trying to advance, the living stones that we're trying to build. I need to be equipped to go out there and love, to be a disciple. How do I do that? How do I do that in every vocation, in any location? Because we're all missionaries. It really doesn't matter what you do. I'm not putting down your vocationary call. It's how you do it. You will know me by the love you show for each other. If you don't show love, forget it. You end up working for God instead of with God. So you got to listen and observe as to what God's doing right now. Then you got to do the same thing within your own personal context. And make sure those two things are in sync, which is to say you got to be in a right and vertical relationship with the Lord. And only then, I would argue, and that's an ongoing process, don't get me wrong, then you can go horizontal. That's the culture of the cross. Be right with me, love God, love people. Game over. It's so hard, though, isn't it? And then you have to listen and observe to the cultural context you're called to engage. That might be the local government here in Orlando. That might be the ethnic community that exists outside of your suburban cocoon that you have euphemistically engaged by taking the urban plunge as a short-term mission trip, and you go there once a year. They might be going overseas. I don't know what that looks like. But you have to do these things first. We have a great friend, Steve Bailey, who has a PhD in anthropology, speaks Lao, most Christ-like guy I've ever met. And he tells his students at Nyack Seminary in New York, he said, if you want to serve God, go to the culture, and you really feel called to go overseas, go over there and just listen for 2 years. Then you'll begin to have an answer about how you're called to engage. Do you have that kind of patience? God does. Chinese do. Why can't we? Okay, then verify. Verify, what does that mean? That means be in relationships of accountability. Test what you're hearing from God and in your own hearts. God gives you passions and skills for a reason. It's not an accident. Think those things through. Talk to the local folks on the ground. Best practices, Doug's group, our group, we always work through a local partner. People who live there. You think we know anything about that culture? We can try, but at the end of the day, it's not the same. And no solution is sustainable unless the local culture owns it. And then engage. Then engage. Now, as I wrap up, the key to all this, if you buy into any of that kind of theology, and I'm not a theologian, I don't play one on TV, the only way to build relationships in this Venn diagram, and you're called to be at the heart of complexity as a Christian, to be shrewd as snakes, is to show respect. Doug said it best. Tolerance is not enough. Tolerance means I allow for your presence. Doesn't mean I have to talk to you. If you look on the back side of the handout there, our first principle of engagement that motivated Dad to found the Institute for Global Engagement is know your own faith at its deepest and richest best, and just enough about your neighbors to respect it. I'm not saying you're going to go out in that shady world of universalism and all roads lead to heaven, let's cooperate and graduate. In fact, I found that as you engage into other people of faith and you acknowledge deep differences, the relationships go deeper because they respect you more for your beliefs, as Pastor James said yesterday. You got to show respect, and you can't show respect unless you know how to listen and observe, unless you know how to love. In a logic that they understand, the recipient of love is always the point of reference. The giver cannot be the point of reference. And we like to do that in our culture, as Ruth pointed out today. I'm the point of reference. Can't spell Chris or Seiple without I. That leads to a lot of problems, right? They're the point of reference. How do I think about doing that? Now, here's the good news in all this, so to speak. Religious freedom and literacy development. How do those things operate there? I would say to you, religious freedom at the end of the day is respect. It's respect for the minority among you. This is a biblical concept. If you don't believe it, read Leviticus. Treat the alien with respect because you were once aliens in Egypt. And God's very clear even later in Ezekiel 47 when they go back to the promised land. Treat the alien among your midst as a natural-born citizen. Natural-born citizen of the nation of Israel, which is to say we're all the same family, as Ruth was saying. Is there a family resemblance or not? Religious freedom is respect. It's loving your neighbor. And if you're a good American, like most of us are, you understand this is important to the founding of our country. Thomas Jefferson called it the first freedom. Where religious freedom exists, so too the right to gather, speak, associate, 2 or 3 gathered to speak and associate, those kinds of things. These things happen. Now, here's some scholarship that's just come out in the last year that I want you to be equipped with, and I can send you the citations later because I know SIL has a lot of PhDs, and that's a good thing. Brian Grimm at the Pew Forum has done the research and makes this basic argument. There is a high mathematical correlation between 0.6 and 0.8 of religious freedom with civil and political liberty, freedom of the press, economic liberty, and the longevity of democracy. They call it, in poli-sci speak, a bundled commodity. You can't have one without the other. Now, I can't tell you where the research is going to go, the chicken or the egg. Does religious freedom first, then these things, or in some cases other things, then it doesn't matter. They're all part of the same thing. You need to be working for religious freedom because religious freedom allows you to do your ministry. It's also reflective of a kingdom theology where people are made in the image of God and they have the freedom to rebel against him. That simple. Let me read you a quote from Brian's recent paper that I'm happy to share with you. And he's a great academic. There's about 5 footnotes in this 2 sentences, which I'm not going to share with you. As more people actively participate in religion, religious groups engage in processes, to use I can never say his name, Amartya Sen's term, that brings tangible benefits ranging from literacy, vocational and health training, to marital and bereavement counseling, to feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, and caring for the sick. Faith-based organizations, for example, are the major providers of care and support services to people living with HIV/AIDS around the world, and there's a growing scientific evidence of the health benefits associated with religious participation itself. Some studies suggest the advent of new religious forms can help improve the lives of women and activate greater civic participation. This is now being revealed in the scholarship. This is not just some Seiple witchcraft mumbo-jumbo based on a loose interpretation of Scripture. Hopefully it's not loose. Hopefully it's pretty grounded. But this is what's being revealed in the secular, tangible impact of things like religious freedom. And scholars are beginning to get this. By the way, the converse is true too. If there's no religious freedom, if people are repressed, people are more likely to rebel, which is something the group-based societies of Asia do not like to see. They don't like to see social disharmony. So religious freedom works in their self-interest if they're educated and equipped to understand why it works in their self-interest. And we don't have the time today, but I could tell you how this logic has played out in Vietnam. The issue I just want to ask you on this religious freedom thing before concluding with literacy development is, how often do we use that kind of language? How often do we relate religious freedom to these tangible things that the entire secular world appreciates and understands from their self-interest or from their do-good moral imperative side? That logic I just read you from Brian Grimm, that appeals to the UN and it appeals to the Chinese government. That's a pretty broad spectrum. But we're not equipped to think that way because we can't link it back to the kingdom theology of we're all made in the image of God, even though that's in every prayer of every church service almost every week. We've got to draw that link. Otherwise, we're irrelevant. Now, what about literacy development? Why is that key to the respect at the middle of the equation or the Venn diagram? I think literacy is the ability to know your neighbor better. Now, literacy, whether it's written, it's oral, and there's all kinds of new movements going on in the Bible translation movement, literacy is the capacity to think about and be educated to understand your world, understand the Scriptures, understand your neighbor. And oh, by the way, especially for Wycliffe and SIL, I know you guys know this, but this is for the non-Wycliffe SIL people in the business, in the room today. SIL has developed a thing called the ethnologue. I'll have somebody else explain it better than I can, but the bottom line is it's a compilation of all the different things, the ethnography of different people groups and how the language developed, all in one place. It is the sterling standard of teaching linguistics in all universities around the world. It's the world standard. That's a pretty good place to start if you're going to engage other spheres of life with something that they need. And now here's what happens when literacy takes place and takes root, all in the name of Bible translation and building the kingdom. Let me just give you a few things. Steve Fisher from the UC Berkeley, a weenie, that's our arch rival from Stanford, so we don't speak kindly of them, but democracy is very rare when large gender gaps exist in literacy rates. If the women aren't educated, you're not going to have democracy. You're not going to have the freedom to associate, believe, and all those kinds of things. When women become literate as adults, these are other papers and I can send you the citations, the mortality and risk of malnutrition is significantly lower. Children are more likely to survive. There's a new paper out from last year. I've not read it as closely as I would have liked, but the basic premise is this. Max Weber, the founder of sociology, was wrong. It wasn't the Protestant work ethic that led to capitalism as we know it in the West. It was literacy development that created the human capital to work harder and smarter and faster. Education among girls leads to growth of households and national income. Health of women and kids increase, lower and wanted fertility rates come about, a higher per capita, higher agricultural yields. All these things go back to women and literacy. Now, we all know this. We've all heard this in some form or another. But how many of us are making that argument as we try and make the case for Bible translation? Because all we're doing is talking to 3% of the evangelical cocoon. There's no amen there, by the way. The other thing that literacy development does is, full circle here, it preserves culture. Which is to say, it preserves the dignity of these people made in the image of God who have been called into this world in very small and different ethno-linguistic backgrounds. Literacy development preserves culture and protects against the onslaught of globalization, which seeks to make us all into McDonald's blue jean wearing, Madonna watching, competitive Americans. But again, the simple question, how many of us use this lingo? How many of us have received a Wycliffe fundraising letter that talks about how this serves our fellow mankind? It's out there. We got to link these two, folks. And I will come back to what I said at the very beginning. I'm not quite sure what the link looks like. I'm throwing a lot of facts at you. I think they're related. There needs to be a lot more scholarship done. But you guys are the ones who are equipped to do it and understand it. And we need it. I'm going to even talk heresy here. We need to even think about approaching governments to support all the things that come out of literacy development. How much money, do you know how much money the Wycliffe USA takes from the U.S. government? 0. Do you think all the things that I just listed isn't in the interest of American policy and serving people around the world? World Vision takes, as of last year, $150 million from the U.S. government. Have they lost their evangelical identity? Do people doubt who they are and what they're doing? It is possible, if we're shrewd as snake, to operate at this diagram and be relevant to people because we have a product that's so good it can't be ignored. And to let that provoke the question about why we do what we do. That's obedience. We're called to excellence. This is what we're called to do as we engage the world. I'll stop there.